larger European intellectual environment is a huge boon to UK science. And we heard the percentages of EU staff, from Professor Farron, at around 23%. In fact, that's almost exactly the percentage of EU staff in the Institute, but it's hugely skewed. So if you look at our technical and scientific staff, it's closer to 45% are European. And that's true at the PhD student level. That's true as people train beyond their PhD. And it's a little bit lower percentage at the level of the senior staff, the group leaders. But still, it's an enormous, enormous percentage, and we benefit from the exchange, from the scientific expertise that these people bring in from other institutes in Europe. Equally, we see migration of UK scientists outside the UK to train in Europe, and many of those then return, bringing back unique expertise. Being part of the Horizon 2020 funding scheme, the ERC funding scheme, is also critically important to us. Currently, this building has 10 million pounds in ERC funding, but it's actually, the impact of this goes substantially beyond the funding itself, because it's being integrated into these large cutting-edge projects as partners with our European colleagues. That is so important. If we want to be part of these consortia that push the very cutting edge of science, we need to be fully integrated into the EU community. Finally, another concern for my clinical colleagues, is their ability to participate seamlessly in clinical trials. There are partnerships that already exist within the EU. For example, Cancer Core Europe is a consortium of 6 institutions spread across 6 different European countries that has diagnosed 60,000 new cases of cancer, and is carrying out, as part of that consortium, 1,500 separate clinical trials. And for a lot of diseases, again, accessing patient populations is critical, and it's very clear why that's important for what one might call rare diseases. But if we look at cancer, as cancer becomes increasingly classified as a molecular disease, you don't just have breast cancer, and you no longer just have a subtype, for example, of breast cancer. You have a particular molecular configuration. And finding sufficient numbers of patients, and I'm sure that AstraZeneca could comment further on this, but having sufficient numbers of patients to bring into those trials needs a large population. And so I think we need to be concerned at all of those levels and put into place policies that allow free movement of our scientific colleagues, access not only to the funding but to scientific partnerships within Europe, and to ensure that we participate, in pan-European clinical trials.
That's very helpful. Now, it has been said by some that if we don't get the right arrangements, particularly in relation to the certification and validation approval of new medicines, that they may come on stream in the UK later than in the rest of the EU, and we can look at other countries around the world where there is some delay. Is that a view that you share, or a concern that you have if we don't get the right arrangements?
Yes, a view that's shared by my clinical colleagues in the Institute. Right. And that would be a direct impact on patients, particularly those patients being treated in the most innovative and cutting-edge ways.
Right. And Dr. Williams?
I think that's the pragmatic answer. You're going to go for a market with 500 million before you go to the market with 50 million. But in addition to that, of course, we have manufacturing going on in the UK, and it will be difficult to justify further investment in manufacturing in the UK if we then can't use those products within the European setting as well. So at the moment, we've stopped additional investment within our Northwest manufacturing facility until we have greater clarity about how that will work moving forward.
Thank you very much indeed. Jonathan.
I have an interest in this slightly as a regional MP, but I'll just be interested to hear your views on the wider implications of what's going on for the area. So if we look at what's going on at the moment, because of, for instance, the very high housing costs in Cambridge, a lot of people are living outside of Cambridge increasingly. Because of the high rents in Cambridge, businesses spreading through the region. And the Cambridge bubble effect, if you like, is spreading through the area to the better of all. And I know from what I hear in my own constituency that there are concerns that what's going on at the moment may reverse what seems to be a fantastic momentum that Cambridge has and that is spreading out through the area. And I'd just be interested to hear your views as to whether you think that is at the moment a concern and perhaps things that we should be doing to try and put forward the best face. Professor Farron.
Well, I'll begin by just setting the context of Cambridge University's role in the development of the region. We are the anchor point of the Cambridge cluster. We are one of the top 3 university-led sort of clusters in the world, up there with the Boston region and with sort of Silicon Valley and Stanford around there. Sort of that cluster has around, we estimate 4,700 sort of companies within it. They employ around 60,000 staff. They have a combined turnover of around 12 billion, so they are major economic players. And we see that the university has played its role in relation to that, particularly through our sort of technology transfer office, Cambridge Enterprise, which is key in enabling sort of startups. And one of the things that is particularly noticeable about Cambridge Enterprise is that its success rate, the 5-year sort of out from there, is significantly higher than the national average. So we are actually developing companies that have sort of sustainability, and we think that's important to the region.
Dr. Williams.
So you characterise the mission well, obviously being a local MP, and we see that in our local staff. So we brought staff into the Cambridge area, and you're right, not as many are living in Cambridge now, only around 20-25%, and they're living further and further and out, which itself creates challenges with infrastructure and housing. Right. But it also has the peripheral benefit, of course, of bringing highly skilled scientists into more diverse areas of the region. Yep. And one of the theories we put forward is, as they then move on to new jobs, they're more likely to work where they live than where their jobs are, and that will help spread the growth within the community. But I think when we moved to Cambridge, we were very keen for it not to be seen as us sucking things out of Cambridge, that we came here as a partner. So we take both our regional and national responsibilities very seriously. So we do a lot of outreach, we do STEM activities, we support the Science Centre, which goes out to Kings Lynn and all those areas which we find more difficult to get to when you're based in Cambridge. And alongside the university, we're participating in programs like Accelerate East, which is looking at ways of trying to coordinate skills development across the eastern region area. So in short answer to your question, regardless of Brexit, we needed to do some more work to bring advantages to those areas of our region which aren't as advantaged.
And in terms of the general momentum that we have at the moment, that everyone in this room, I'm sure, would recognise, do you have concerns that that is a risk at the current time?
The momentum actually is growing at the moment. So we could look at a business group, local business groups, Cambridge Ahead, are showing life sciences growth of 10, 20, 30%, depending on the measure you use for that. And that momentum has at least continued since AstraZeneca came, has probably accelerated. If there was one thing I would ask, what do we need to do to maintain that? I mean, we have to increase our basic funding in R&D as a country. I think we've got a commitment now to go up to the OECD average in 10 years. Well, that's a bit long, considering Brexit's coming potentially in a year or two's time. And it would still put us far behind our main competitors in, say, Germany and the US. Now, obviously, that's a big ask as a country. But if you really want to know the answer to how do you maintain your R&D science base, which is excellent, which is what keeps us in the UK and brought us to Cambridge, then an increase in that R&D funding is what's required.
Separate from it being a European issue, separate from where the funding comes from?
At the moment, Germany spends about 50% more on R&D than the UK, and the US about double. So we more than punch our weight, and it's astounding that the Cambridge University, amongst others, are so successful within that environment.
Thank you.
Okay, Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Chair. Can I pursue, Dr. Williams, some of the points you were making in answer to the Chair at the start? In evidence to the Business Select Committee, AstraZeneca suggested we need quite a long transition on the way to Brexit, maybe up to 5 years. At the moment, it looks much more likely as we'll either get perhaps a 2-year transition period, which is what the Prime Minister's been talking about, or we might end up, if the negotiations aren't very successful, we might end up on trading on WTO rules from March of next year. From the pharmaceutical sector's point of view, what would those two scenarios mean?
I think if we were to just leave now, or whenever it is March next year, we would go back to WTO rules, which would obviously affect trade. We've estimated that costs AstraZeneca only around $30 million a year in additional trade costs. Our bigger concern to some extent is the bureaucracy associated with that, which we will be able to handle, but smaller companies may not be able to. But I think, again, I'd come back to what I started with. The bigger concern is patients in Europe would no longer have access to their oncology medicine. So material generated in the UK, without any agreement, without any harmonisation of the EMA, there is not a process by which at the moment they would get their medicines. So we're asking for a minimum 3-year transitionary period. We're just figuring out parallel testing in our Swedish site, which actually might be, for us, we have slight advantages, remember. So we have a Swedish site. So we already have the infrastructure in place. We don't have the people. And you have to have the qualified person to do the work. And that qualified person has to be resident in the EU as well, according to EMA rules. And so I'll stop there.
Just pursue that a little bit further. Your big competitor, GlaxoSmithKline, has talked about what this would mean for them. They've said, again, this was in evidence to one of our select committees, that they would need to build 6 new labs and reauthorise products, and they put the cost of that between 60 and 70 million pounds. Just a technical point, I don't quite understand why they need to reauthorise products. Is that something that you need to do as well?
We would need to do that. The advantage we have is we would have a Swedish site. So you have to, when you validate clinical material and in-market material, it has to be done within a validated lab as well, using validated equipment, following validated assays and validated processes. So it's not a very straightforward process, and quite rightly too, because these are things you're putting into patients. So there's a lot. It's a lot more than just sending a sample over the Atlantic and then over the North Sea, and then doing a couple of assays. It is a very highly controlled, necessarily controlled regulatory process.
But products that are authorised at the moment, why does Brexit mean they've got to be reauthorised?
Yeah, it's not to do with authorisation. It's to do with validation of material. Once pharmaceuticals are authorised, they are authorised within the country of uses which they have. I don't think they require reauthorisation. But what they do need is each time you release a new batch of material, that batch of material needs to be quality tested before it can be released into the market. And it needs to be done under very strict, what we call GXP conditions, so good laboratory practice, good manufacturing practice, so that you can ensure that the material is safe to use.
And your point is that after Brexit, it would have to be done twice rather than once.
It will need to be done theoretically. It will need to be done in the UK for the UK market, and then we'll have to transfer it over. And if there is not harmonisation of the regulatory environment, then we'll have to retest it in the EU. And as I'm saying, that is not a trivial. Once you've got it, once all that's in place, that infrastructure in place, it's not too much work, but it's not trivial setting that up. Particularly like in our competitor Glaxo's case, they don't have those labs already in place in a European location because those labs themselves have to be validated.
GSK. Your £70 million, it'll be a bit less for you because you've got some of that infrastructure already there.
To be fair, we haven't costed it yet. It will be considerably less than us. But when you've got Zoladex, we've got the Zoladex plant up in the northwest, generating how many patients? I've got a number here somewhere for you. 120,000 patients in Europe with prostate and breast cancer. We don't really want to have to tell them they can't have their medicines. So that it's kind of, at the moment, we've got very much a people focus on this. We'll figure out the financial cost at some point. It won't be as high as 70 million, but at the moment, it's a patient challenge that we have. And of course, it's a patient challenge both in the wider context of the pharmaceutical industry. It applies both in the UK and in Europe. in both directions, if organisations don't have their batch release mechanisms ready in time, then that will hinder the progress of medicines across Europe.
Thank you. Finally, can I just ask Professor Ferran a question? I know your background is in company law and commercial area. What do you think the impact of coming out of the EU on WTO terms next March would be, particularly for the financial services sector? How do you see that panning out?
Okay, that's my other capacity as a law professor. Well, I think on WTO terms, in the context of financial services, is complicated because we're talking about services rather than goods, and the key problem with services is not sort of tariffs in the form of monetary tariffs, but regulatory tariffs. So it's really about the regulatory alignment that you need for that. If I could just add on from the university side, I mean, for the things that are most concerned to us, access to research funding, access to student funding, WTO terms, again, is not what's relevant. And for us, it's whether we get access to FP9 and associated programs. And the timing on that is that those new programs would begin the beginning of 2021. So in a sense, that's the key sort of transition date for us, and whether we are going to be in the next set of framework programs, whether we're going to be in them for the full 7 years or not.
Anything more on financial services? I mean, you know, what's...
On financial services, my view is that the ideal model would be one that is hybrid, that in part relies on EU equivalence, sort of in areas where that works. And I think we need to be realistic about that. In other areas, moving to a regulatory alignment based on international standards, and recognising, for example, in the banking area, that actually it's whether the on-the-ground supervision is working effectively or not that is crucially important. And so in a sense, you might ask by saying, what level of regulatory alignment do we need for supervision to be effective?
Sorry, Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's just really a follow-up to what Dr. Williams was saying, and I just declare an interest as a board member of the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and of the Innovative Vector Control Consortium. You mentioned that, of course, this would be, if there was the necessity to do batch testing, this would be reciprocal, and therefore European manufacturers who supply into the UK would need to do batch testing in the UK for a much smaller market than UK manufacturers doing batch testing in Europe. Would this have cost implications for UK consumers, particularly the National Health Service?
It would come down to how... It's hard to say, to be honest. I think products which are already licensed for approval in the UK, undoubtedly I would expect foreign companies to add in the batch release costs in the UK. Would it impact it really depends on the pricing mechanisms. It's hard to say. It's not a huge cost once it's set up, so it's the setup costs which will be expensive.
And do you think there would be cases where European manufacturers would simply say it's not worth going through the trouble for a market of 65 million people, or do you think that the flow would be maintained?
I think for drugs which are already approved that we maintain, you have to remember that we're still people as well. So the idea of withdrawing products from a market where patients are in need is something that the industry will be very reluctant to do. Where it may impact again is if you're going for your market authorisation in Europe, it may delay even further your attempt to go into market or approval within the UK.
So it's more likely to be on new drugs rather than existing drugs that you will.
We are getting a bit theoretical. I think it would still happen. I just think it's more likely to cause further delay and complexity.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you very much, Chair. My first question I wanted to direct to Mr. Lawrence, if I could, and to ask about the European Space Agency. The European Space Agency is not an EU agency. Not all EU member states will be members, and not all ESA member states are EU member states. There's also some participation by Canada in selected programs and activities, and in some of the ESA's decision-making process, I understand. You talked at the very beginning about concerns around Galileo, Copernicus, etc. I wanted to explore just a little bit with you in relation to the European Space Agency, whether you saw there being legal or institutional or other barriers to us having a continuing relationship, and just to say more about what you would also want the UK space sector to be getting out of its future relationship with the European Space Agency.
Yes, it's very important to for the UK to be part of the European Space Agency, and the fact that is separate from the EU is helpful. But I think, going back to the earlier point, the European Space Agency's work is often directed towards EU space programs. So the European Space Agency is effectively the R&D arm of the EU space policy. So if the EU decides to commission a next generation of navigation satellites or Earth observation satellites or space surveillance and tracking, it will turn to the European Space Agency to deliver those programs and potentially to operate some of those programs in orbit. So the difficulty, the risk and the difficulty that could occur is that if the EU program, for example Galileo, the navigation satellites, includes some security elements or some aspects that the EU wants to keep as EU capability, there is a risk that non-EU members, even if they're a part of the ESA, would be excluded from certain parts of those EU programs. And that is a live issue now for Galileo, because there are security elements of the Galileo system, and there is a real risk that UK companies who've historically been very successful in providing security elements, cryptography and this kind of thing, could potentially be excluded from future iterations of that satellite system.
Raise these concerns directly with representatives of the UK government? And
yes, there is good dialogue between UK Space, the Trade Association, of which my company is a member, and the UK Space Agency. Good engagement and in terms of sharing issues, looking for potential mitigation, and really exploring all the potential options. And clearly there are, going back to again the earlier point, the issue at the moment is there's uncertainty, so it's hard to actually be definitive about how the UK can participate in procurement that's live at the moment and procurement in the future, and particularly shaping the new programs that are emerging at the moment. So another example is the EU is just adopting a new strategy for space surveillance and tracking, so bringing together UK assets, European assets for tracking space debris and minimising the risk of collisions between satellites in orbit. So the UK, France, Italy, Spain, as a subset of the European Space Agency, getting together to effectively create the EU policy in this important area. So at the moment, the UK has a very important role in helping shape EU policy, along with 4 other larger member states. But if we're not in the EU, we won't be shaping that policy, and then we've got much less chance of actually delivering some of the operational systems into the future.
So in that respect, what you're also saying is that it could jeopardise our role and our leadership in space sector in the future,
yeah.
Even if we stay in close relationship with the ESA.
Yes, yes.
And
I mean, it's absolutely essential. We're a key member of the European Space Agency, and we are at the moment, and the government in recent years has increased its commitment to the European Space Agency. However, that isn't the only answer, that isn't the only issue. We have to be part of the EU policy making in space, and the EU is a big user of space systems. It's the space policy of the EU is developing all the time. As I mentioned, space surveillance and tracking is the next big program coming along after the navigation and the Earth observation programs. So that's where the research focus will be driven from the EU space policy, and ESA will respond to that, and the ESA member states can take part in those research programs, but they could be restricted from taking part in the delivery of those programs if there's an EU policy issue that means non-EU members can't participate.
Could you talk us through a little bit more about how the space sector is currently regulated?
So there are some regulations at a kind of international level, sort of UN regulations on access to outer space and this kind of thing. There are more local regulations across Europe covering things like frequency and spectrum for communication satellites, and there are national regulations, and there's a bill going through Parliament to open up launch opportunities from the UK. So there are multi-levels of regulation. The UK participates in a number of different bodies, for example, through Ofcom in the frequency and spectrum discussions. So I think there will be, through the UK Space Agency, continued engagement in all of these regulatory bodies. Many of them are intertwined with the EU. I'm not an expert on space law, so I don't know exactly all of the intricacies, but it's clear that the EU as a bloc does take a big part in setting global regulations, and then each nation interprets the EU regulations in certain instances for its own national interests. So the example of the Space Bill going through Parliament, which opens up launch opportunities for UK, is a kind of subset of a broader international picture.
In terms of how the UK participates in the development then of regulations, would you say that we participate as an individual nation at UN and other levels in that global discussion, or is it primarily through the EU bloc and participating in the EU first and then coming out?
It's both, but I think the UK is seen as one of the major space nations within Europe, so often if there's an EU context, the UK will be an important player in those broader EU discussions as well.
So we may continue, if we're limited through the ESA, we may, and leaving the EU, we may continue through the other forms across that are relevant for developing regulation.
Yes,
but our voice would be weakened.
Yeah, I think the EU as a group does carry a lot of weight in terms of broad negotiations in these issues.
EU-wide bodies you would want to see us maintain a close relationship with?
We participate in EUMETSAT, the weather services. I think that's probably the next one that I would mention beyond the European Space Agency. Probably others that I could think of, may get back to you with a few other examples.
I could just ask a final question that would be for input from the panel. It's just taking further the points that you've been making about the proportion of staff as EU nationals and the impact of current Brexit policy on them. Have your organisations responded to concerns raised by your staff or students from the EU as to how Brexit might affect them? And have any of those concerns been alleviated by the agreement on citizens' rights, or sort of working towards the agreement that was announced before Christmas?
Yes, to whether we've taken steps. We've worked very hard to get out a message at our senior levels, from our Vice-Chancellor and others, that that we are welcoming and that Cambridge is a place which is diverse and open and inclusive. And in terms of giving practical advice, we've been providing very specific as well as general advice to our staff and students, and assisting a lot of them in applying for sort of permanent residence status. And we will continue that in the transition through to the new settled sort of status. And yes, I think the announcement in December is helpful, sort of equally on students. I think it has been helpful. I think for students, the key issues have been not just about their status, but also about for fees. And there, I think the government has been helpful in terms of providing assurance for those who are in the system and will come into the system in 2018. We are starting to get concerned about 2019 because, of course, the admissions round starts early, and indeed we're gearing up for it now. So that really will need to be, for our purposes, because we have an early admission date by October, we really will need clarity on that certainly, ideally by April, and certainly August would be too late. Otherwise, that will have a big impact, we think. And we saw that in 2016 when the number of applications went down because there was uncertainty.
Just some numbers from my company were relatively small. In May 2016, we had 21 staff and 70% of them were EU nationals. As of today, we have 15 staff and 50% of them are EU nationals. We've seen a number of people returning to Spain, where our parent company is based. I can't say that directly that was a result of Brexit, but clearly the uncertainty and the lack of clarity about their future status means that these highly qualified staff could work anywhere in Europe, so they just decide to go, and we've lost 5 people back to Spain.
So as you'd imagine, we put in similar processes as the university have. So we have a specific Brexit page. We provide both information and support where we can, practical support in applying for residency and things like that as well. But I would give you, contrary to what the university said, we are seeing some people leaving. So it would be fair to say, as Brexit announced, you know Cambridge is very much a Remain area. There was a lot of upset and concern, but generally not a lot of movement. And things have settled down, and there has been some reassurances. But the places where we have seen a difference is in what we'd call our global roles, that rare global talent. And we have got examples in our strategy groups where the global talent, one person in particular just left and got a job in France. And we said, why have you done that? So, well, I'll wait and see, and I'll come back if things sort out. And so the thing you have to realize about global talent is they have choices. They choose to be in the UK, and actually part of one of the definitions of being a global talent is you're prepared to go anywhere in the globe to get your job. So, and why that's particularly dangerous for us is that the global talent are the ones who bring the groups and the activity and the additional activity. So although they're fairly small in number at the moment, and we're not seeing a mass movement of EU residents back into the EU, it's the reason we came to Cambridge was to be an attractive place for that global talent with all the things it brings with us. And some of them are EU nationals, some of them from the rest of the world, but we're just seeing anecdotal evidence, as in specific 1, 2, 3 cases of them moving elsewhere.
So I think that the agreement certainly gave some comfort, and I know this from personal experience from a lot of the EU nationals in my own lab who have been watching this very closely. But of course, the best thing would be for this to be codified, and actually the sooner that this becomes part of UK law, the better. We are seeing impacts, and again, it's hard to quantify this precisely when you're talking about a global talent pool, because the pool is so small and every situation is sort of an N of one. But I have heard examples from my own institute. One of our faculty was chairing a very prestigious fellowship panel for CRUK. One of their top candidates was offered £1.3 million in funding to come from the EU to the UK. And again, you know, these are top fellowships, incredibly competitive, highly sought after, and he declined, citing uncertainties over Brexit as the reason to take a position elsewhere. So while we might not be seeing shifts in these, you know, large populations of European students and postdocs that are yet quantifiable, I think we are seeing examples over and over again at this very, very top level of an erosion in our ability to recruit.
Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all of our panellists for spending some time with us today. I wanted to drill down a little bit more into the issue of regulatory alignment, and taking as the base for this that there's two really important areas of regulatory alignment from the point of view of the European Union. One around the supply and licensing of medicines and medical equipment and the supply of those, and the other around clinical trials. And I was wondering if the panel, if you could just provide either choosing one of those areas or both, and just set out a little bit what you think could be the risks and costs of regulatory divergence, or indeed if you see any potential opportunities from regulatory divergence, either in the area of clinical trials or in the area of licensing of medicines and medical supplies. Maybe start with yourself, Professor Hannon.
So from the clinical trials perspective, it's absolutely critical that we have regulatory alignment. Again, so CRUK funds roughly 200, I believe, clinical trials at the moment, and about 28% of those actually have a European component to them in the patient populations. And so if one were to lose access to European patients from an outward-looking perspective, that would reduce our ability to do the highest quality clinical trials. From an inward-looking perspective, if we didn't have regulatory alignment, it would compromise our ability to participate in these larger pan-European efforts, and I cited Cancer Core Europe as one of those, where you have a very large consortium able to draw on large patient populations to do really the most cutting-edge and innovative, genomically informed, patient-specific precision medicine clinical trials. So regulatory alignment in that space is absolutely critical to the UK remaining as one of the leaders in that space.
Thank you.
So I guess we considered it, what would happen if we were to become more divergent from a regulatory perspective. And I think the main challenge with that, of course, because you do the thought exercise, but then you look at how the EMA was established and the role that MHRA played in that. So the MHRA actually played a leading role in establishing the EMA and still lead on a lot of their activities. And so you're really looking for you don't really want to be going to the lowest common denominator. You don't want to be going for a lower safety standard than you do in Europe than would in the UK. So the only area we potentially thought where the MHRA could be competitive, if you like, to the EMA is just in speed, that we may be able to establish processes which will allow us to work more quickly. But as Professor Hannon would say, you still need to have regulatory harmonisation, or else you won't be able to use the same material across different clinical trials. So we looked at it, and it's not you don't play around with safety. It's just not somewhere that you can go easily, other than through potentially going quicker.
I think you've heard the sort of clinical experts speak. I would just say more generally, I mean, of course, we collaborate and have research consortia all around the world, so we manage some of those divergence issues in what we do. But our key partners and our main partners are with Europe, and that has been facilitated by not just free movement, but also the sort of common standards and the common regulatory framework, which has just taken out a lot of the kind of bureaucracy associated with managing those consortia.
Just out of interest, have you done any assessment of what the cost might be in terms of both time and resource, opportunity cost, and financially, of having to create a separate regulatory regime for the UK, or to somehow disentangle us from the currently sort of deeply intertwined UK-EU regulatory regimes? Have you, in the scenario planning that you've done, I'm just wondering if there's any tangible definition of what that actual cost would be in tangible terms?
It is difficult to do, but the first thing we're asking for is certainty to know what the future relationship is going to be. So we know some basic building blocks, like you need to establish a lab starting off establishing a lab in the EU, which can do GCP and GXP type activities. But until we have that certainty, so business is very good at this. You tell us what the rules are, and we'll go and figure out how to do them. There is only so much you can do theoretically until you know what the rules are.
So I've been informed by my policy advisor that CRUK is actually commissioning research in this area to really try to calculate what the financial impacts will be. But I think you brought up a really important point on opportunity cost. And you know, I guess I keep harping on this, but you know, it is the opportunity to participate in the EU intellectual environment and in the EU clinical environment that is absolutely critical and that has to continue. But there's also financial opportunities. So there are clinical trials that are happening on this site which gathers significant European funding. So there's also going to be a cost associated with the loss of those. There's a particular breast cancer trial that would not have happened without 1.6 million euros in European funding. And so we have costs associated not only with the establishment of a different regulatory network, but we have opportunities that will be lost and trials that we just won't participate in.
Just with one final question then. You, I'm sure, have been following the debate about what the future relationship between the UK and the EU could or should be with great interest. And it's boiling down, I mean, this is a personal view, I hope you'll forgive me for giving that personal view, but it seems to be boiling down to a choice between what people are calling a Canada-based model or a Norway-based model. So the Canada-based model being a very deeply integrated in terms of trading goods, but not so much in terms of services and some of the regulatory alignment that we're talking about here. The Norway model being European Economic Area, EEA countries being pretty much aligned with most of the acquis communautaire and all of these regulations and directives that we're talking about today. If you were advising the British government right now as we go into this critical phase of the Brexit negotiations, would you be pushing for a Canada model or for a Norway model? Professor Ferran first.
Well, the Canada model doesn't work for us because it doesn't address the issues that we have. So of those choices, we would definitely be advocating Norway model, which would keep us in all of the funding programs and would ensure student mobility and researcher mobility as well. But of course, that means we would be assuming free movement, which would be part of the Norway model. If that's not politically achievable, we would want as close to that as we can get by a bespoke deal, keeping us in FP9 as an associated country. If we can't get that, then we would want whatever the UK puts in place to be, by way of alternative funding, to be not just at a monetary level comparable to ERC funding, but also capture the really crucial thing about European funding and ERC in particular, which is if you get an ERC grant, you've won a competition against the best in the world. And so anything that the UK would do would need to deliver that sort of genuinely international excellence as well.
Dr. Williams.
So without looking behind my policy advisor, I'm pretty confident we haven't taken a view on that. So I'd come back to some things I said before, is that we do need, one is we need regulatory certainty so we can plan for the future. Obviously, continued membership of the EMA or harmonisation is key for us. But also just smooth supply, so trade as well to an extent. So global supply of medicines, our supply chain just goes backwards and forwards all over the place. So it'll take a lot of work to unpick that if we have barriers between supply of materials between the UK and Europe. So but it's probably a bit of both, isn't it?
Right. Professor Hammond.
So again, just to sort of echo Professor Ferran in a way. So certainly I think we would prefer a model where we maintained as much of our ability to recruit that top-tier global talent as possible. I think that the point made about FP9 is right on the money. And I think that there is evidence that we as a research enterprise compete extremely well amongst the best in the world. And in fact, UK draws disproportionately to its population from the ERC granting system. And so though we are not the largest country, we've been exceptionally successful and generally at the top of the list for getting individuals grants from the ERC that support individual science. And then if you look at the nationality breakdown within that group that from the UK that gets these grants, it's very mixed. It's about 50%. There's about equal representation of UK citizens and EU citizens, which says that not only are we competing in the ERC granting system with the best in the world, but we've attracted those researchers to the UK that are of that caliber from Europe.
Thank you very much.
We definitely need freedom of movement. We need the best possible access to the single market. So I'm not sure if Norway model's better for that. We need access to the Horizon 2020 programs, and we need access to the European Union space programs. So I think all of those things are not delivered either by Canada or the Norway agreement. There's something different, and they're much closer to today's situation.
Thank you. Pat McFadden.
I've been listening to all this, and I suppose I want to ask a slightly provocative question at the end. The picture you've all painted this morning is of the crucial value of collaboration in Europe to everything that you do, whether it's cancer research, drug development, space, whatever. And you've then expressed a desire on the institutional basis to continue to take part in the European institutions that are there for that, European Medicines Agency, European Space Agency, and so on, and said that the best that we can hope for following Brexit is a more passive participation where we might still be able to take part if we manage to negotiate that, but we'll probably lose at least some of our policy-making power that we currently enjoy. Have I accurately summed up what you've told us this morning? Okay, so my question is, what is the point of Brexit? Mr. Lawrence, do you see any point in this at all?
There's nothing positive about Brexit at all.
Right.
Full stop.
Professor Farron.
I thought you might ask this question. The only positive that I can see is that it has actually put the spotlight onto universities, and it has, you know, we've always made the case that we are a very successful part of UK sort of operation, and we are globally successful, and we are competing at the highest level. And maybe Brexit is giving us an opportunity and a challenge to get that message out there sort of more strongly. But that's as far as I can go.
Dr. Williams, what's the point of Brexit?
Thanks for that question. So just a point of clarity, the EMA is not about collaboration, it's about a regulatory authority and getting and things through the process. So the point of Brexit, positives. Well, I mean, you presume you all know AstraZeneca's stance before the vote. I guess the positive from our perspective is you always have to look at change as potential disruptive change and therefore an opportunity for innovation. See, I'm doing my best. So what we have seen coming out.
By the way,
so what we
just to interject, I wasn't asking this because I was asking you to be either positive or negative. Just from your point of view, whether there was any point in this. I know what my view is.
I can't say that. I'm not sure. It's a bit subjective about point. I think from an objective perspective, it's allowed us to develop the life science industrial strategy, which actually, for the first time in quite a while, has brought together all the different players across the industry, academia, and government into what looks like a fairly rational plan. And I think an implementation of the life science industrial strategy will, to an extent, help put us into a better position moving forward. Now, you could have done that without leaving the EU. But it sometimes takes a disruptive pressure like that to take you somewhere different.
Well, so I'm an immigrant myself, moved here before Brexit from America, thinking that I was coming to Europe. And so it is difficult for me now in retrospect to see very much positive about it.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much. I just want to start off with a specific one for Professor Ferran. We've been made aware of an agreement between Imperial College and the French National Centre for Scientific Research so that all their researchers will have equal access to funding, resources and opportunities for collaboration. I'm sure you're probably aware of that, but wondered if Cambridge University was looking or already had in place similar arrangements.
We're doing a lot of contingency planning and thinking. Our planning at the moment is very much based around people, because we see people as being absolutely central to everything we've been talking about. So we've put in place arrangements with a number of institutions. With the Max Planck Institute, we have a new centre with our social anthropology department to enable joint working between the two. We've also put in place a new arrangement with Sciences Po in Paris, again, to facilitate academic exchange of staff and students. Indeed, their first launch event is going to be a conference on the future of Europe. So very much working politics, history and public policy. In terms of putting a physical hub in Europe or anything like that, we are we are looking at all options. We have established a research lab in Singapore. We expect to have others in Asia in the coming years. We will be open to doing that in Europe as well, if it's appropriate to the sort of research that we're doing. But we're essentially building around people in what we do.
Thank you very much indeed. My second question is for everybody, and it really follows a little bit on from what Pat asked. In my area, although we had one of the highest Remain votes in the Midlands, the vote to leave was still higher than the Remain vote. I was not able to persuade people otherwise, and in places like Stoke-on-Trent, very close to me, it was higher still. So this comes down really to integration within the UK and social cohesion within the UK. What can all of your organisations do to ensure that we move towards greater social cohesion within the UK? I mean, Dr. Williams has moved, AstraZeneca have moved down from Macclesfield to Cambridge. How can we see things move from Cambridge to Macclesfield or to Stafford or to Stoke-on-Trent or to Wolverhampton, so that we see the great benefits of all the great work that you're all doing spread throughout the UK rather than being based in certain clusters? Perhaps we start with Mr. Lawrence.
So my company is based at the Harwell Space Cluster in Oxfordshire, along with the European Space Agency Centre and the Satellite Applications Catapult Centre. I think the ability for the UK to work as a whole in the space sector is exemplified by the way the Catapult Centre has actually set up regional centres across the country. So one in Scotland, Durham, in the southwest, the south coast and the East Midlands. So I actually sit on the advisory board for that regional centres group. So I go out to these the different centres regularly twice a year for meetings. And from a business point of view, we're also trying to develop our business in conjunction with these regional centres. So we've been doing some work in County Durham on a tourism app based on positioning technology. And we've also engaged in potential projects in collaboration with the University of Southampton and Portsmouth from the South Coast Centre. So I think there is a broad development opportunity for the space sector across the UK. It's not all based around the big companies, particularly the applications of space technology. So people are using location services, people are using Earth observation data in many different domains. And so the boundaries of the space sector are actually quite permeable, and we're finding that by helping new companies understand what data is available and how to access that data, how to integrate that data with our data sets, we can build more business. So there is definitely growth potential across the UK in many different areas, and finding those connection points is actually what the Satellite Applications Catapult are trying to do.
The new University Vice-Chancellor made one of his first visits around the UK a week or so ago to Stoke-on-Trent, to actually talk to students about Cambridge and getting the message out to kind of the UK that we really want students from all over the UK of all backgrounds to come. So I mentioned that in particular, I mentioned Stoke. One of the things that we have done is to look at what students who've come to Cambridge from the EU have then gone on to do in the UK. For example, looking at our education faculty and students in the UK from the EU who have then got their training in Cambridge and gone into schools across England and Wales. And we could do that in other sort of sectors as well. We just chose education, and it was really quite revealing. There's a number of our alumni who are going out into the rest of the UK from the EU and elsewhere. And the third example that I would give in terms of kind of spreading Cambridge's success, and it's a regional example, would be in the agritech area, where what we have done is to bring together a consortium of East Anglia, working in agritech ourselves and Johnny Dis and ARU and others. And that consortium is working locally, but it is also a key partner with us in a relationship with the Government of India around agritech. So we are kind of bringing the global to the region and also bringing the region to the globe. And that's a key part of what we're doing.
So contrary to all the stories, we haven't actually exited the Northwest. So we now have over 2,000 people in Cambridge, but we also have almost 4,000 people remaining in Macclesfield. And that partly tells you the answer to your question. I think what you have to understand is the pharmaceutical industry is global, so you need to be globally competitive. So you can't mess around, you have to be in the places where you can be globally competitive. We're globally competitive for R&D in Cambridge, and despite ongoing situation, we are still globally competitive in Cambridge. We've got a fantastic science base, we've got great universities, we've got great institutes. It's going really, really well. So let's not lose that message. The reason we're still in the Northwest is the potential there for advanced manufacturing capability as well, which could also be global and world leading. So my answer to the question would be really we need to identify where we need to be globally leading, where we can be globally leading, and how we position that. There is a case for clusters. Undoubtedly, Cambridge is successful because there's this small set of people in a relatively small area. But that doesn't mean that supply chain, that staff can't live further out, that there are activities we can do. So it's really recognising that global competitiveness. So wherever it sits, whether it's in Newcastle, there's a thriving life science sector in Newcastle, up at Dundee, find out where you're globally competitive and work on those. If you try and force yourself to be globally competitive where you clearly aren't, you'll lose it.
So I'm surprised I haven't had a note from my policy advisor on this. I think so. So from, from a CR UK perspective, right, we are one of 5 Cancer Research UK institutes. There's one in Glasgow, Manchester, Oxford, Cambridge, and then at the Francis Crick in London. Those sort of serve in a way as clusters, but the reach of Cancer Research UK is much broader because they provide grants to researchers at institutions across the UK. So that's sort of the CR UK perspective. If you think about the perspective of our own center, you will have this afternoon Professor Richard Gilbertson, who is the chair of the Department of Oncology here and head of the CR UK major cancer center that they have at Cambridge. And I would suggest that you ask him this question because he's been crafting programs to extend the reach of the major center here throughout hospitals in the region, and he's been doing a lot of work on that. And I'm sure that he could give you a really great perspective on how the cancer center here is trying to unify a much broader community.
Thank you. Can I ask a question about trade in goods, and to what extent the work that you are doing is dependent on getting stuff arriving quickly? Are you worried about our future trading relationship, delays, anything you require just in time? Is that something you've thought about at all? Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
Certainly for the satellite manufacturers in the UK, Airbus, Satellite Technologies, they are part of very complex integrated international supply chains. You could have satellite components that originate in one country, move to another country, come back, go to another country. You know, you could have 10 or more steps in the movement of hardware. And you also potentially have teams of engineers who move from one place to another to actually help commission or test their satellite in someone else's facility. So I think the space companies who are dealing in hardware are really worried that any barriers that through customs or tariffs or whatever get in the way of that quick movement of their hardware and the movement of their engineers to support that hardware would be a real problem to them. Because
your businesses have developed precisely on the basis of that integrated supply chain over a period of 44 years.
Exactly. So companies like Airbus, you know, very international heritage, and so they've got competency centres all around Europe. The UK has some really important parts of that network, but and the company itself will be trying to think what's the most efficient way to build and test bits of hardware. So at the moment, it's very integrated. Any barrier in the way that makes that smooth transition more difficult will cause the company to think, well, is there a more efficient way of doing this? Should we put all of our navigation systems in Germany, for example? It's easier than having some part of that done in the UK.
Yeah. And in respect of pharmaceuticals and research, are there any supplies, materials, nuclear materials, whatever, that you obviously routinely depend on for the work and the research that you're undertaking? Professor Hannan, please.
Yes, so, I mean, again, this is really speaking from a great deal of personal experience.
Sure.
From the time that I've spent the last three or 4 years here in Cambridge. And what I have noticed is that there is a very big difference when we try to do procurement within the EU versus outside the EU, particularly in terms of the potential for long delays. And I do fear that if my experience, for example, in trying to do procurement from the US was transferred, if that degree of complexity also applied to Europe, that would put us at a competitive disadvantage.
Okay. Dr. Williams?
So it's one area where we have done the financial analysis. So we think around $30 million in additional annual duty outwards and about $5 million duty inwards due to our global supply chain and the movement of materials. When you talk to the wider industry, their concern is obviously the costs, but perhaps for smaller companies, just their ability to adapt to the new bureaucracies that will come in place and whether they have the infrastructure to even do it. So complexity at customs and border control may make this very difficult for the smaller companies.
Now that's assuming that we came out on WTO terms, I presume.
So it's quite complex pharmaceuticals. So actually the WTO terms for pharmaceutical products is reasonably good, and many countries have signed up to the fact that active pharmaceutical ingredients have no cost associated with transfer across borders. But there are still some countries which aren't, but they're covered by EU relationships with those countries. So it's generally those countries who aren't in the WTO active pharmaceutical ingredient agreement.
Can I ask another question about data and the transfer of data between the UK and EU countries? Because, I mean, we've looked at this as a committee, and either the Article 50 deal is going to have to reach an agreement that allows us to continue to be able to transfer data on people in particular, research trials, that kind of thing, on the current basis, or the Commission, as we understand it, looks at third countries and decides whether the way in which they handle data meets European standards and will issue what is known as a data adequacy decision. There are a number of non-EU countries that have those decisions. Is that something you're concerned about? Is it something you've looked at all? Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
There is an example that I know the UK Space Trade Association are worried about. There is a Copernicus data centre in Newport, which holds many gigabytes of data from the Earth observation satellites. That there is a question mark, I guess, about the status of that centre post Brexit, if it hasn't been specifically organised as part of an agreement. I'm not an expert on the ins and outs of the policy around that data, but that's a good example where there is a lot of effectively EU space data being managed and held and disseminated from the UK.
Okay, thank you very much. Any? Yes, Professor Hannon.
So I think this again bears on the whole clinical trials regulatory framework.
Right.
And again, if we're going to participate in these broader clinical trials that include an EU component, we have to have, again, harmonized regulations on protection of human subjects' data. And this will be absolutely critical, otherwise, again, we'll be frozen out.
Okay, thank you. Now, you've all talked about the importance of people and having access to the right people with the right skills to the work that you're undertaking. Have you had any conversations with the government about what a future work visa system might look like if free movement as we currently understand it no longer continues? And do you think the government is listening to any representations that you made on that subject so that it continues to be possible for you to get access to the right people? Because at the moment you're having to do that in respect to people who come from outside the EU, because you've made reference to the fact that some of your staff are EU and some are from other parts of the world. Now, Professor Hannon, do you...
So I haven't been a party to any such discussions, but I have had experience firsthand of this. I do think that we need to consider the impact, which would be largely negative, of treating this European highly skilled workforce in exactly the same way we treat the immigration of non-European highly skilled workers. That having been said, I went through that immigration system, and in comparison to the experiences I've heard when I used to bring foreign workers into the U.S., I felt it was quite smooth. But there needs the challenge will be that the impact of having to have an immigration system for highly skilled EU workers will be enormous. So to deal with those workers that are already here, to deal with this 45% of our technical workforce that we need to recruit from there, there will need, I think, to be both a tremendous amount of thought to create the capacity to deal with that in a timely fashion, and a hope that there would be provision made that would streamline the process for these really highly skilled workers.
Professor Ferran.
Yeah, we've thought a lot about this. So we're currently the 6th largest user of the Tier 2 visa in the country. I think we're the 2nd highest higher education institution. It costs us 90,000 a year. We're putting through 450 people a year, and our estimate that it's costing the staff members individually, sort of just for the staff member, 500,000, and when you add in their dependents as well, it's probably about 1.5 million a year in cost. It takes around 3 months. We have a very efficient office dealing with it, but it's a painstaking sort of process. So simply extending the existing Tier 2 to EEA staff would not be welcome by us or by the sector. We have developed our sense of what an ideal future model would look like. It would essentially be based on the existing tier one exceptional talent, but would be extended beyond the existing level of professors effectively to really cover team science in its entirety. It would have to include not just the PhD level and above roles, but also the technicians who are critically important to what we do. And we think that could be done in a way that is relatively unbureaucratic by trusting higher education institutions to do a lot of the work and to rely on peer review for it. And in terms of whether we're getting through on that, we have had the opportunity over the past year to present some of that sort of thinking and the data behind it. We hosted a meeting of civil servants from the Home Office and BEIS and others earlier in 2017. We also participated here with others in a session with the chair of the MAC, sort of fed into that. We were slightly encouraged by some of the tweaks to the immigration system in the autumn budget statement, some of the sort of relaxations around the tier one route, and indeed actually some of what's in there sort of is consistent with views that we had put in working together with RC UK and the MRC. So in a sense, there's some positive signs there.
This is one area in which what happens is entirely in the hands of the UK. It's not dependent on the negotiations. Depending on what happens, it's for the Home Office to design a new system. Now, Jonathan, you wanted to come in?
Just to back Malhotra's question before, where we did receive evidence that there have been recruitment issues. But the examples that were given by all of the witnesses were actually ones of perception. So in other words, that you mentioned that people people missed out on UK jobs because they said they didn't have confidence in the Brexit process, or they didn't know there was a lack of certainty in effect. Are there any other issues that have been coming up? Because, of course, post the Phase 1 deal, there is now certainty pretty much in terms of what the status of EU citizens will be, and if we get the future system right in the way that Professor Ferren was just explaining, is this an issue that we can sort out? Is what I'm trying to get at, or are there, leaving the EU, is it just going to be bad news? Can we work through it? Is what I'm trying to say.
I think we can work through it, but I was interested in meeting of some of our top younger scientists in physics earlier this week. Actually, the greatest concern was coming not from the EU postdocs, but from the non-EU international staff, because they were saying, well, you might sort it out for the EU, but then potentially leave no room for us, type of thing. So I think we have to look at this in the round.
Thank you. And any other, anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, just from the space sector point of view, there are about 38,000 people directly employed in the UK space sector, and 11% of them are non-UK nationals, so it's a big issue for the industry. And this mix of EU and non-EU talent that we need to attract and maintain in the UK is a big question, so we need to have an integrated approach to the future.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Dr. Williams wanted to say something.
I should just make the point, we also have many UK nationals working in our Swedish operation, so it's not just a UK issue. So we are working with both our European trade bodies as well as the UK trade bodies to sort that out.
Has anyone seen any evidence of UK nationals being given a harder time overseas as a result of the Brexit proposals?
We've not seen that in Sweden, no.
No one else. And we've been talking about attracting the brightest and the best, but of course, particularly when it comes to manufacturing, there are all sorts of levels of skills involved. This is a part of the country where skills are in short supply. We have very low levels of unemployment and very serious skills issues, not least as a result of that. In terms of attracting lab technicians and so forth, are these types of people, is it like nurses where a very large proportion of them are EU nationals? Is it an issue at the lower end of the scale, if you like?
For us, it's perhaps not at the lower end of the scale. We have issues there around attracting lab technicians, and we are participating in the apprenticeship sort of agenda.
But you're saying not a Brexit issue?
That's not Brexit sort of issue. We do have a big concern around specialist technicians who are absolutely critical to the conduct of science, and we have lots of examples of instances where these are very specialist skills which we would like the UK to develop a workforce to have, but at the moment it doesn't exist. And so we are dependent on, in particular, EU staff and having access quickly to those EU staff as well. And really that's one of our biggest concerns, to ensure that in this discussion around immigration, that layer of staff, as well as the PhD and above, are taken into account.
Thank you. Dr. Williams.
So I'd agree with Professor Farron. It's not particularly a Brexit issue, but perhaps it jolted us into moving more quickly. So we're on the board of the Science Industry Partnership, which is looking at new apprenticeships and new skills. There was an announcement in the budget that they're going to set up a Cambridge life sciences part of that to try and nucleate the life sciences industry. What we have seen, because life sciences isn't a particularly strong area for apprenticeships, very few apprenticeships, we've seen quite a big increase in the apprenticeships within AZ MedImmune in the last 2 or 3 years. And obviously pulling those apprenticeships from the local community is easier than from wider. So I think I wouldn't directly lay it on the path of Brexit, but I think it's something the industry was having to recognise, that those lower level skills need to come from the lower level skills, which are still high level skills, are better sourced from the local community than trying to pull them in from further afield.
Professor Han.
So we have a little bit different experience, but so definitely for specialist technicians, we need the opportunity to draw from Europe. These skills are scarce. They are exceptionally difficult to find, particularly in the competitive environment within Cambridge that right. The presence of our industry partners has created. And so, but I also want to make the point about the flow of students sort of pre-PhD, and it would be sort of our version of apprenticeships. We have a tremendous number of students who are on the path to PhD, to entry to PhD programs, who come and do short-term internships in the institute, and I don't really know what the immigration implications of Brexit would be for that class of scientific migrant. But I think it is important to recognize that is also part of our intellectual exchange and also part of our mission as an institute of education.
Okay,
thank you.
Now, I think there's a couple of final very quick questions from Jeremy Lefroy and then Stephen Timms. Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Hilary. You're all effectively global or globally connected organisations, so it doesn't so much apply to you. But talking about opportunities again, I'm the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Ethiopia, and I've noticed a real interest now from significant countries such as Ethiopia, saying you've really not been interested in us for many years. On the aid side, yes, but not on the trade and research and development. Are you noticing in your supply chains, perhaps the smaller businesses with whom you deal, that there is a greater awareness of the need for the UK to be more connected globally? Because we've often heard that UK SMEs are much less likely to be involved in trade globally and exports than, say, the German, Italian, Spanish and French counterparts.
I think, certainly from an AstraZeneca perspective, we are active in Africa. We actually have a big activity going on, Healthy Heart campaign in Africa, which I think we put about $300 million worth of drugs to try and increase, looking at things like diabetes, which is a growing challenge in Africa. So we are very much aware of the African market.
I'm thinking more of your supply chain. Obviously, you're a global company, but others that you come across.
Well, what we're seeing increasingly in terms of manufacturing, you're seeing an increasing requirement from countries to manufacture in the place that you want to sell your product. And so that counters against going into countries which don't have a large requirement for the medicines that we make. So it's a tricky one.
Yes, I think we clearly need to look more internationally. There's been a very good initiative from the UK Space Agency in the last few years, their international partnership program. So they provide part funding to enable companies to get together and collaborate to deliver products and services in developing nations around the world. So we've got projects, we did something in Dubai, we've done work in Guatemala and Mongolia, just starting a project in Mongolia, which we wouldn't have done if we hadn't had this piece of extra support to enable us to sort of get out there, understand the user needs, and then develop a service. But that could be done inside or outside the EU. It's not really a Brexit issue.
Stephen Timms.
Dr. Williams, you told us earlier that one positive from Brexit has been the life sciences industrial strategy. Now, I think I'm right in saying that the coalition government was working on the life sciences area, but I take it from what you've said that you've seen something significant change since the referendum. I just wonder if you can tell us what it is, what's happened.
I guess it's put more energy behind the life science. So Sir John Bell brought to the committee of both industry, academia and the institutes together to look at how we re-energise. And it was an answer to the Brexit question, what do we need to do in response to that? I guess that's the positive side. The negative side, we haven't actually seen the implementation yet. So what we're really asking for is implementation of the life science industrial strategy. And one of the early ones of that was increase in R&D funding. So we've seen some movement in that area. But there are many other aspects of that industrial strategy which we'll need to implement if we're going to remain globally competitive.
And a final question from me. At the moment, the government is about to start to negotiate a transition period, implementation period, whatever you want to call it. Do you, as individuals and organisations, have a view about how long that should be? The Prime Minister in her France speech talked about around 2 years. Given some of the things that you've described in the uncertainty and so on, and working on the assumption that during a transition most things will stay the same, do you have a view about how long that should be? Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
I think it needs to be as long as it takes to secure some of the issues that we've been talking about. And there are multiple issues from an economic and science and innovation point of view, as many others outside of the remit of this group. So it needs to be as long as it takes. It needs to be done in a way that actually responds to the real issues. Clearly, this is a political decision to leave the EU, but let's not get the politics to actually screw up the rest of the economy and the culture and the security of the nation.
So we've had a go at it. So as you know, we've set up our parallel testing at the moment. We think around 3 years, 3 or more years, will be what it takes to demonstrate that equivalence if we do move to a non-harmonised model.
Well, for us, it's the beginning of 2021, which is when the next FP9 programme kicks in. And then there's the question of, are we in that for 7 years or not? The one reservation we have about a long transition is that if it is not clear where we're going, then we have that overhanging uncertainty throughout that period. So I think, yes, as long as it takes, but also that there is a growing sense of what it's going to look like, which will provide some comfort.
I mean, I think it depends on the answers to a lot of the questions that were raised today. So the more harmonized we are, the shorter transition period could be.
Fine. Well, that brings our proceedings to a conclusion. First of all, can I thank on behalf of the committee Mr. Lawrence, Professor Ferran, Dr. Williams and Professor Hannon for the evidence you've given. It's been really, really useful. We've learned a lot and you have definitely adhered to my request to be succinct and to the point, and that's why we've covered a lot of ground, and that will assist us greatly in the work that we are doing. Can I also say that we are pleased to be joined here today with by local members of Parliament. Daniel Zeichner is sitting up at the back and is observing proceedings. I think we hope to be joined by Heidi Allen at some point during the rest of our day here. We will now be moving as members of the committee to a round table with business, academic and health representatives, and then we're having a tour of the Laboratory of Molecular Biology. And if any of you want to read the transcript of the evidence sessions being taken today, or I think to listen to it if you want to hear it again, It's not available on the BBC iPlayer, but I'm advised you'll be able to find it on the Parliament website. And as I said at the beginning, if you're interested in the work of the committee, you can find a lot of material, transcripts of all of our evidence sessions and the reports that we have produced. And I hope you will see the evidence session that we've heard today reflected in subsequent reports that we produce. And once again, can I thank our witnesses for joining us today and for giving up your time. Order, order.